as more of the koala's habitat is compromised. I raised a proposal for an inquiry into the koala in the Senate just before we rose. But the Senate, the big parties, either ridiculed the proposal or voted it down. Well, ladies and gentlemen, every day we wake up, there are more mouths to feed on this planet, and there's less land to feed them. As I speak, climate change-fuelled drought and fires are compromising the farmlands of Russia and Germany. And a massive flood is moving down the fertile Indus Valley with a displacement of 15 to 20 million people in Pakistan. And I pause here for a moment to extend our commiseration to the people of Pakistan facing this extraordinary disaster, and commit to be behind our government putting much more into coming to their aid for a reparation which the people tell us maybe cost $15 billion in the future. Here in lucky Australia, however, top-grade land for growing wheat, potatoes and fruit is being permanently taken out of production by rapidly spreading suburbs, highways, monoculture plantations, fuelled by the absurdity of the big parties' managed investment schemes, and worst of all, by climate change. The Garnaut report to the Rudd government predicted that 90% of the productivity of Australia's own greatest food bowl, the Murray-Darling Basin, could be lost due to climate-induced drought, heat and pests by the end of this century. But Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott haven't mentioned that fact during the election campaign. Ackland on the Darling Downs is at the top end of the Murray-Darling Basin and would be, you'd think, premium safe country in the hands of our political strategists in this age of mounting global food insecurity. But not so. Instead of saving Ackland, a coal company, which in a masterstroke of greenwash is called New Hope, is getting the nod from Labor politicians in Brisbane and Canberra, as well as the coalition. The coal will be burnt, loading the atmosphere with more carbon, hastening global warming and perversely accelerating the destruction of the productivity of what's left of the Murray-Darling Basin and threatening the 128,000 Australian jobs currently in that basin, producing the food upon which we all depend. This coal madness, the NASA Institute's James Hansen, who alerted Congress to the threat of climate change in 1988, calls it criminal, will rip 6 to 20% off the gross domestic product of our grandchildren, according to Sir Nicholas Stern. Sir Nick spoke at this very podium 3 years ago, but as far as the Coalition and Labor are concerned, he might as well have been talking on Macquarie Island. He's coming to Australia, as we've just heard, again soon, and I hope the next Prime Minister will this time listen to him. The tragedy of Ackland underscores the planning irresponsibility of Labor and the Coalition, and their economic irresponsibility in committing to never having a carbon price. I was astonished on Monday when Julia Gillard followed Tony Abbott's commitment to never allowing a carbon tax. Her reversion there was little different to the fallback on mining tax to the big miners a month ago, although I can tell you less alarming. The Prime Minister's backdown to big coal and coal ore mining corporations will cost future budgets after 2013-14 some $9 billion per annum. Worse, Tony Abbott, leader of the Coalition, spell that C-O-A-L-ition, says he won't collect a dollar out of the mining super profits from coal and iron ore. His total surrender to the miners will rip $20 billion out of Australia's future budgets. That's $20 billion ordinary Australians will pay in tax starting with small business. Or else it's $20 billion not available for nation building, for high-speed rail between our cities, or for modern, fast, clean, efficient, cheap light rail within our cities. Just 20% of that $20 billion could fund a national dental system to help the 500,000 Australians now on waiting lists to get dental care. This reasonable tax income will enable the Greens, unlike Labor or the Coalition, to put $2 billion extra into Australia's education system. Let me quote to you from Professor Richard Teese from the University of Melbourne's opinion piece in The Age on Monday. It is a failed vision of public schooling that subjects the Labor Party to the indignity of scavenging on the scrap heap of failed education reform. The Greens, by contrast, start from the premise that public schooling is intrinsically valuable and the best vehicle to engage all children. They want a public system that is, quote, recognised as among the best in the world, end of quote. He goes on to say, can either of the big parties say this or mean it? Is either prepared to draw out the consequences, setting high standards for all public schools, adopting the funding priorities that this requires, and making durable improvements in the quality of the teaching force, end of quote. Australia ranks 18 out of 30 in a comparison of OECD nations for funding to public education if you exclude tertiary as a percentage of GDP. Based on the most recent available figures, for Australia to be a leader of the OECD instead, spending around 4% GDP would require an additional $5.2 billion. Well, the announcement I'm making today takes us 2/5 of the way to the call by Rupert Murdoch some 10 years ago for an extra $5 billion annually to go into education in Australia. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, the Greens support the mining super profits tax as originally proposed by Wayne Swan, Kevin Rudd and Treasury. That would raise about $20 billion, as I've said. However, as a first step in the new parliament, the Greens will negotiate an adjustment to the mining tax so that it raises an additional $2 billion that will boost the public school system to fund a range of important areas. Let me name some. We would check all Indigenous children to ensure they don't lose their hearing to otitis media, that's middle ear infection, at a cost of just $3.5 million. Hundreds of children in Northern Australia are suffering from hearing loss in this wealthy nation of ours. In some places, that's more than 10% in a classroom. They're suffering from an inability to compete in learning, and the Greens will put an end to it. We will also invest $320 million over 4 years in a Commonwealth Teaching Scholarship program. This will provide 3,000 teaching scholarships worth $5,000 a year each for up to 5 years. Scholarship recipients will be required to work in a public school of high need for 3 years. The program will cost an estimated $17 million for the first year and up to $80 million a year ongoing. And it will help address teacher shortages which are predicted to grow with increased retirements. Our teacher mentoring and support initiative would cost $600 million over 4 years. It will support early career teachers who are at high risk of leaving the profession within 3 to 5 years and fund school trials up to $70,000 to employ trial schools, that is, up to $70,000 to employ an additional teacher to reduce workloads of first-year and mentor teachers, as well as $5 million for establishing and running that mentor training scheme. The total cost per year, $150 million. The Greens will also bring back the Restoring Asian Languages Literacy in Schools program at a cost of $94 million over 4 years. Underfunding for the Asian language program over the past decade has resulted in a significant decline in the study and completion rate of this hugely important program for Australia and for our neighbourhood.